The screen fades in from black, and we're immediately greeted by the sight of a man sitting on a weathered wooden bench in a bustling city park. His posture is slouched, his shoulders heavy with an invisible weight. He wears an impeccably tailored navy blue suit that still holds traces of its former glory. Perhaps it was once pressed to perfection, but now it shows faint creases, as if it had been hastily packed into a suitcase or crumpled in frustration. His tie is loosened, the knot slightly askew, and his polished leather shoes are scuffed at the edges, evidence of countless miles walked on unforgiving pavement. This isn't just any man. This is someone who has seen better days, someone who used to command respect simply by walking into a room. But today, he looks like a ghost haunting the remnants of his own life. His name is Richard Alden, or at least that's what people used to call him when they whispered about him in boardrooms, at charity galas, and during late-night business. Deals sealed over glasses of single malt scotch. Now, though, no one knows him here. No one cares. He sits alone, clutching an empty wallet between trembling fingers, staring at it as if it might suddenly produce answers to questions he doesn't even know how to ask. How did I end up here? His eyes seem to plead silently as the camera lingers on his face, capturing every wrinkle etched by years of ambition and regret. We hear the faint hum of the world around him. Children laugh somewhere off-screen, their voices carrying the innocence of lives untouched by failure. Cars honk impatiently in the distance, reminding us that time waits for no one. And then there's the sound, a metallic clink, sharp and jarring against the ambient noise. A coin rolls across the ground, coming to rest near Richard's feet. For a moment he stares at it, his expression unreadable. Is it shame? Anger? Desperation? We can't be sure, but whatever it is, it feels raw and unfiltered. Now, let's rewind a little. To truly understand Richard Alden, we need to peel back the layers of his story to uncover the events that led him to this moment of profound vulnerability. Because Richard wasn't always this broken man sitting on a park bench. Once upon a time, he was a titan of industry, a self-made billionaire whose name was synonymous with success. Flashbacks begin to play, not abrupt cuts, but seamless transitions woven into the fabric of the present scene. As Richard gazes absently at the horizon, the camera shifts subtly, blurring the line between reality and memory. We see Richard in his prime, standing atop a skyscraper overlooking the glittering skyline of Manhattan. He's younger here, his hair darker, his jawline sharper. Around him, executives nod approvingly as he delivers a speech filled with bold promises and calculated risks. "This is just the beginning," he declares confidently, his voice resonating through the glass-walled conference room. Behind him, a PowerPoint presentation flashes statistics and projections, each slide reinforcing the idea that Richard Alden is unstoppable. But beneath the surface of this carefully curated image lies a man driven not by passion, but by obsession. Success became his drug, and he consumed it voraciously, never stopping to consider the cost. These flashbacks aren't just glimpses into his past, they're windows into his psyche. We see him hosting extravagant dinner parties aboard luxurious yachts, surrounded by friends and colleagues who laugh too loudly and smile too brightly. Yet even in these moments of apparent triumph, there's a lingering sense of emptiness. Richard often finds himself standing apart from the crowd, observing rather than participating, as if searching for something he can't quite name. And then come the cracks in the facade. One particularly poignant flashback shows Richard arguing heatedly with a business partner, a man named Thomas Bennett, whose name will become significant later. They're in a dimly lit office, papers scattered across the desk, voices rising in anger. "You're playing too fast and loose, Richard," Thomas warns, his tone tinged with desperation. "If you keep making decisions like this, you'll destroy everything we've built." Richard dismisses him with a wave of his hand, his arrogance palpable. "I don't have time for caution," he snaps. "Caution gets you nowhere." These scenes alternate with quieter, more intimate moments from Richard's personal life. We see him missing his daughter's ballet recital because of a last-minute meeting. We see him forgetting his wedding anniversary, only to send an expensive gift as a hollow apology. Each decision, each sacrifice chips away at the foundation of his relationships until there's nothing left but rubble. His wife leaves him, taking their children with her. Friends drift away, unwilling to endure his increasingly erratic behavior. By the time the financial scandal hits, a cascade of bad investments, fraudulent partnerships, and plummeting stock prices, Richard is already isolated, a king without a kingdom. Back in the present, Richard lowers his head, resting his elbows on his knees. His breathing grows heavier, almost labored, as if the weight of his memories is physically pressing down on him. He closes his eyes briefly, and when he opens them again, there's a flicker of determination, mixed with despair. He knows he can't stay here forever. He needs to move, to find shelter, to survive. But first, he needs money, just enough to get him to the next step. And so, reluctantly, painfully, he rises from the bench and begins scanning the crowd for someone who might help. It's here that we introduce Clara Bennett, though neither she nor Richard realizes the significance of their impending encounter yet. She appears in the background, a blur of motion amidst the static figures of pedestrians. Her presence is understated but magnetic, drawing our attention even before Richard notices her. She's wearing a simple denim jacket over a white t-shirt paired with jeans and sneakers. There's nothing remarkable about her appearance. No designer labels, no flashy accessories, but there's a warmth to her demeanor that sets her apart. She walks briskly, her head tilted downward as she scrolls through her phone, oblivious to the world around her. For a few seconds, the camera focuses solely on her, allowing us to observe small details that reveal her character. She pauses briefly to drop a few coins into the cup of a homeless man sitting against a lamppost. She smiles softly at a child who waves at her from a stroller. These gestures are fleeting, almost imperceptible, but they speak volumes about who she is. Clara isn't wealthy, nor does she pretend to be, but she carries herself with a quiet strength, a belief in the goodness of humanity that seems almost naive in a world as harsh as this one. When Richard finally approaches her, his hesitation is palpable. He hesitates not because he doubts her willingness to help, but because asking for assistance goes against every fiber of his being. Pride has been both his greatest asset and his most destructive flaw, and swallowing it now feels like choking on shards of glass. Still, necessity overrides ego, and he forces himself to speak. "Excuse me," he says, his voice hoarse and uncertain. Clara looks up, startled, and for a moment their eyes meet. Hers are curious, perhaps tinged with suspicion, while his are guarded, hiding decades of pain behind a mask of stoicism. I need some help," Richard continues, stumbling over the words, "just enough for bus fare, please." It's a simple request, but the effort it takes for him to utter those sentences is monumental. Clara studies him for a beat longer than necessary, her gaze softening as she senses the depth of his struggle. Without saying a word, she reaches into her pocket and pulls out a handful of coins. She places them gently into his palm, her touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than expected. "Thank you," Richard murmurs, his voice barely audible. Clara nods, offering a small, encouraging smile before continuing on her way. As she disappears into the crowd, Richard stares after her, his mind racing. Who is this girl? Why did she help him without question? And why does her kindness feel so foreign, so alien, in a world that has turned its back on him? Before moving forward, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've witnessed so far. Richard Alden's journey from billionaire to beggar is not just a tale of financial ruin. It's a story about identity, pride, and the fragility of power. Every choice he made, every corner he cut, led him inexorably to this moment of reckoning. And yet, despite his fall from grace, there's a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, however slim it may seem. If you're enjoying this story and want to see where it leads, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more compelling narratives like this one to life. As Clara walks away from Richard, her footsteps echo softly against the pavement, blending seamlessly with the ambient sounds of the bustling city around her. To an outside observer, she might appear unremarkable, a young woman going about her Day, lost in thought or distracted by the glow of her phone screen. But beneath her calm exterior lies a complexity that mirrors Richard's own fractured journey, though their paths couldn't seem more different at first glance. Clara isn't just anyone. Her name is Clara Bennett, and while she may not carry the weight of a ruined empire like Richard does, her life has been shaped by loss and resilience in ways that make her uniquely suited to cross his path. She's 24 years old, a senior at a local university studying social work, a field she chose not out of obligation but out of a deep-seated desire to make a difference. Growing up, Clara learned early on that kindness could be both a shield and a weapon, a way to protect herself and others from the harsh realities of the world. The camera follows her as she navigates the crowded streets, weaving between pedestrians with practiced ease. She moves with purpose, her posture straight but relaxed, exuding a quiet confidence that belies her modest background. Occasionally, she glances down at her phone, scrolling through messages from friends or reminders about upcoming assignments. Yet there's something restless about her gaze, as if part of her mind is elsewhere, replaying memories she'd rather forget. To truly understand Clara, we need to step back in time, much like we did with Richard. But where Richard's flashbacks were dominated by opulence and ambition, Clara's are rooted in simplicity and struggle. We see her as a child, sitting at a kitchen table cluttered with bills and overdue notices. Her mother, Evelyn Bennett, sits across from her, pen in hand, trying to balance the family budget. "We'll get through this," Evelyn says firmly, though her voice trembles slightly. Together. Even then, Clara understood that money was tight, but she also learned that love and determination could fill many gaps. Evelyn was the heart of the Bennett household, a woman whose warmth and generosity radiated outward, touching everyone she met. She instilled in Clara the belief that no matter how hard life got, there was always room for compassion. "When you help someone else," Evelyn would often say, "you're really helping yourself." These words became Clara's guiding principle, shaping the person she grew up to be. But Evelyn's optimism couldn't shield them from tragedy. When Clara was 16, her father, Thomas Bennett, died suddenly of a heart attack. His death wasn't just a personal loss, it marked the beginning of the end for the Bennett's financial stability. Thomas had been a successful entrepreneur, running a chain of hardware stores that thrived for decades. However, unbeknownst to his family, he had made some risky investments behind the scenes, leveraging the business to fund ventures that ultimately failed. After his passing, creditors came knocking, and within months, the once thriving company collapsed under the weight of debt. These events are revealed gradually, interwoven with present-day scenes of Clara walking home from the park. As she passes familiar landmarks, a coffee shop where she works part-time, a community center where she volunteers, the camera dips into her thoughts, showing fragmented images of her childhood. We see her standing in the doorway of their house. As movers cart away furniture, her face pale with shock. We see her comforting her mother during sleepless nights filled with tears and whispered prayers. And we see her vowing silently to rebuild their lives piece by piece. Despite these hardships, Clara never allowed bitterness to take root. Instead, she channeled her pain into action, throwing herself into schoolwork and extracurricular activities. By the time she graduated high school, she had earned scholarships that allowed her to attend college, a feat she viewed as both a triumph and a responsibility. She knew she couldn't waste the opportunity, not when so many sacrifices had been made on her behalf. Now, as a college senior, Clara juggles classes, work, and volunteer commitments with remarkable efficiency. She spends her mornings serving lattes and cappuccinos at the cafe, chatting amiably with regular customers who adore her sunny disposition. In the afternoons, she attends lectures on sociology and psychology, scribbling notes furiously while professors discuss systemic inequality and the importance of empathy in social services. And in the evenings, she dedicates herself to various community projects, from organizing food drives to mentoring at-risk youth. It's during one of these volunteer sessions that we glimpse another side of Clara, a side that hints at unresolved anger simmering beneath her cheerful facade. She's leading a discussion group for teenagers who have experienced homelessness, listening intently as they share their stories. One boy, barely older than Clara herself, talks about being abandoned by his parents and forced to fend for himself on the streets. His voice cracks as he describes sleeping in subway stations and scavenging for food in dumpsters. Clara nods sympathetically, offering words of encouragement, but her jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. Later, when the session ends and the teens disperse, she remains seated, staring blankly at the floor. Her colleague, a middle-aged woman named Linda, notices Clara's expression and approaches cautiously. "You okay?" Linda asks gently. Clara hesitates before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Yeah, I'm fine," she says, forcing a smile. "It's just, sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, the system keeps failing these kids. Like nothing ever changes." Linda places a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. "Change takes time," she says, "and people like you're the ones making it happen. Don't lose sight of that." Clara nods again, appreciating the sentiment, but deep down, she wonders if it's enough. Is volunteering and advocating really enough to combat the injustices she sees every day? Or is she simply putting Band-Aids on wounds that require surgery? This internal conflict is what makes Clara such a compelling character. On the surface, she embodies hope and resilience, qualities that inspire those around her. But underneath, she carries scars that haven't fully healed. Her decision to help Richard earlier wasn't just an act of random kindness. It was a reflection of her ongoing quest to find meaning in a chaotic world. By giving him those coins, she reaffirmed her belief in humanity, even if only for a fleeting moment. Little does she know, however, that her encounter with Richard is far from coincidental. As she continues walking home, the camera pans to reveal a small photograph tucked inside her wallet. It's a faded picture of her father, Thomas Bennett, standing beside none other than Richard Alden. They're smiling broadly, arms slung over each other's shoulders, the epitome of camaraderie. The photo captures a time before betrayal tore their partnership apart, before greed and recklessness destroyed everything they had built together. For now, Clara remains unaware of the connection between Richard and her father. But fate has a way of unraveling secrets, and soon enough she'll discover the truth about the man who borrowed money from her and the role he played in her family's downfall. Before moving forward, let's pause for a moment to reflect on Clara's story. She represents the flip side of Richard's coin, someone who has faced adversity but chosen to rise above it with grace and purpose. While Richard's journey is one of redemption, hers is about finding justice, not just for herself, but for all those who have been wronged by systems designed to favor the powerful. If you're intrigued by her character and want to see how her story intertwines with Richard's, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to create content that explores complex themes and unforgettable characters. After their initial meeting in the park, Clara finds herself unable to shake the image of the man in the suit from her mind. There was something haunting about his eyes, dark pools of despair that seemed to hold entire lifetimes of regret. She tries to convince herself it's nothing unusual. After all, she helps people every day through her volunteer work and part-time job at the cafe. Yet this stranger felt different somehow, as though he carried a weight far heavier than mere financial hardship. The next morning, as Clara serves coffee to customers at the bustling cafe, her thoughts drift back to him. She wonders where he might be now, whether he found shelter for the night, or if he's still wandering the streets, searching for answers he may never find. Her colleague Linda notices her distracted demeanor and teases her lightly. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asks, leaning against the counter. Clara smiles faintly, brushing off the comment with a vague reply. "Just thinking about someone I met yesterday," she says, not elaborating further. Later that afternoon, while walking home from class, Clara decides to take a detour through the same park where she encountered Richard. It's not entirely intentional, she tells herself. She's simply taking a scenic route, but deep down, she knows she's hoping to see him again. When she arrives, the park is quieter than before, its usual bustle muted by the overcast sky looming above. She scans the area, her heart skipping a beat when she spots him sitting on the same bench, hunched over with his head in his hands. Richard looks up as Clara approaches, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, neither of them speaks, the silence stretching taut between them like an unspoken question. Finally, Clara breaks the tension with a soft greeting. "Hi," she says, her voice tentative but warm. "I thought I might find you here." Richard hesitates, unsure how to respond. He's not used to being sought out, especially by someone who has no reason to care about him. "You came looking for me?" he asks, his tone laced with disbelief. Clara shrugs, feigning nonchalance, even as her pulse quickens. "Well, I figured you could use some help. You didn't exactly look like you were having the best day yesterday." She sits down beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. Up close, she can see the toll his circumstances have taken on him. The hollow cheeks, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the faint tremor in his hands. Despite his disheveled appearance, there's an undeniable air of dignity about him, as if he's clinging to the remnants of a former life with everything he has. For a while they sit in companionable silence, watching leaves swirl in the wind and listening to the distant chatter of children playing. Then, almost instinctively, Clara reaches into her bag and pulls out a sandwich wrapped in foil. "Here," she says, holding it out to him. "I made extra lunch today. Thought you might be hungry." Richard stares at the offering, torn between pride and hunger. Eventually his stomach makes the decision for him, growling audibly enough to elicit a small laugh from Clara. "Go ahead," she urges gently. "It's just food." He takes the sandwich reluctantly, unwrapping it with careful movements. As he eats, Clara begins to talk, not about anything profound, just casual observations about the weather, the park, the quirks of city life. Her words flow effortlessly, filling the space between them with a sense of normalcy that Richard hasn't experienced in months. For the first time since his fall from grace, he feels seen, not as a failure or a cautionary tale, but as a human being worthy of kindness. Over the next few days, their encounters become a pattern. Clara continues to visit the park, bringing food, spare clothes, and occasionally books she thinks Richard might enjoy. At first, their conversations are superficial, limited to polite exchanges about trivial topics, but gradually they begin to open up to each other, sharing fragments of their lives in bits and pieces. One evening, as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Clara asks Richard a question that catches him off guard. "What happened to you?" she says softly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "If you don't mind me asking." Richard freezes, the sandwich he'd been nibbling on forgotten in his lap. He considers deflecting, brushing her off with a vague response, but something in her expression stops him. She isn't prying out of morbid curiosity. She genuinely wants to understand. Taking a deep breath, he begins to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency. He tells her about his rise to wealth, the thrill of building an empire from scratch, the intoxicating rush of power. He describes the deals that went sour, the betrayals that shattered alliances, the scandals that brought everything crashing down, and finally he admits the hardest truth of all, that he blames himself for his downfall. "I got greedy," he confesses, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was invincible, untouchable. I stopped caring about the people around me, the ones who mattered most. And now," he trails off, gesturing vaguely at his surroundings, "now I'm paying the price." Clara listens intently, her expression unreadable. When he finishes, she doesn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, she nods slowly, as if processing his words. "That must have been hard," she says simply. "Losing everything you worked for." Richard chuckles bitterly. "Hard." Doesn't even begin to cover it. They lapse into silence again, but this time it feels less awkward, more contemplative. Clara leans back against the bench, tilting her face toward the fading light. After a moment, she speaks again, her tone thoughtful. "You know, my dad used to tell me stories about a guy he worked with once, someone who taught him a lot about business. His name was Richard Alden." Richard stiffens, his blood running cold. He turns to look at her, his eyes wide with shock. "Your father?" he stammers. "Thomas Bennett?" Clara nods, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah, why? Did you know him? Richard exhales sharply, running a hand through his hair. I did, he admits, his voice barely above a whisper. We were partners, for a while anyway, until... He trails off, unable to finish the sentence. Clara's expression darkens as realization dawns. Until what? She presses, her voice sharper now. Until you ruined his company? Until you left him drowning in debt? The accusation hangs in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Richard flinches, guilt written all over his face. I didn't mean for any of that to happen, he says desperately. I swear, Clara, I made mistakes, terrible ones, but I never wanted to hurt anyone. Least of all, your father. Clara stands abruptly, pacing a few steps away before turning back to face him. Her emotions are a whirlwind, anger, sadness, betrayal, all swirling together in a chaotic maelstrom. Do you have any idea what you put us through? She demands, her voice trembling. My dad died thinking he was a failure because of you. My mom had to sell everything we owned just to keep a roof over our heads, and now you're sitting here, acting like you deserve pity. Richard lowers his head, unable to meet her gaze. I don't expect forgiveness, he says quietly. But I am sorry, more sorry than you'll ever know. The anger drains from Clara's face, replaced by a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. She sinks back onto the bench, staring at him with conflicted eyes. Why should I believe you? She whispers. How do I know you're not just saying what I want to hear? Richard doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out the wallet he'd been clutching during their first meeting. Inside, tucked behind a faded ID card, is a photograph, the same one Clara carries in her own wallet. It shows Richard and Thomas standing side by side, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like old friends. He holds it out to her, his hand shaking slightly. Because this was real, he says. Whatever else happened, your father was my friend once, and losing him, it broke me too. Clara takes the photo, studying it closely. Tears well up in her eyes as memories flood back. The sound of her father's laughter, the warmth of his hugs, the way he used to hum tunelessly while working in the garage. For the first time, she sees Richard not as the villain who destroyed her family, but as a flawed, broken man who has suffered losses of his own. Before moving forward, let's pause to reflect on this pivotal moment. What began as a chance encounter has evolved into something far deeper, a collision of past and present, pain and possibility. Richard and Clara's connection is fragile, fraught with unresolved tension, yet it holds the potential for healing and redemption. If you're captivated by their journey and eager to see where it leads, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to craft stories that resonate deeply and leave lasting impressions. The revelation of Richard's connection to Clara's father hangs heavily in the air, like the calm before a storm. For a moment, neither of them speaks, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Clara holds the photograph tightly in her hand, her knuckles whitening as she struggles to process the magnitude of what she's just learned. Richard sits motionless beside her, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with guilt and resignation. The park around them seems eerily silent now, as if even nature itself is holding its breath. Finally, Clara breaks the silence, her voice trembling, but resolute. You knew him, she says, more statement than question. Her eyes bore into Richard's, searching for answers he isn't sure he can give. You knew my dad, and you let him lose everything. Richard exhales sharply, his chest rising and falling with the effort of containing decades of regret. I didn't let it happen, Clara, he replies, his tone strained but earnest. It was never supposed to go this far. We were partners, friends, brothers almost, but I got greedy. I made decisions I thought would protect us both, and instead, his voice cracks, and he looks away, unable to meet her gaze. Instead, I destroyed him and myself. Clara shakes her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. Do you know what it was like for us after he died? Do you know what it felt like to watch my mom work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table? To see our house sold off piece by piece because we couldn't afford the mortgage? Each word cuts through the night like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. You weren't there, Richard. You didn't have to live with the consequences of your choices. Her anger is palpable, radiating outward in waves that make Richard flinch. He wants to defend himself, to explain how the collapse of their partnership had spiraled out of control faster than he could react. But he knows no excuse will ever be enough. Instead, he nods slowly, accepting the full weight of her pain. "You're right," he says quietly. "I wasn't there, and I can't change what happened. All I can do is try to make amends for your father, for your family, for everyone I've hurt." Clara stares at him, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wants to lash out, to scream and cry until every ounce of bitterness inside her is spent. Another part, a smaller, quieter part, wonders if Richard truly means what he's saying. She's spent years carrying the burden of her family's loss, shouldering it alone because there was no one else to share it with. Could she really trust this man, this stranger who once held her father's fate in his hands, to help shoulder that burden now? Before she can respond, Richard continues, his voice growing stronger despite the tremor beneath it. "I don't expect forgiveness," he says. "Not from you, not from anyone. But I want you to know something. Meeting you has changed me. Seeing the way you care about people, the way you fight for justice, it's reminded me of the person I used to be before. Before all this." He gestures vaguely at his surroundings, encompassing not just the park, but the wreckage of his life. "If you'll let me, I'd like to help you, not because I owe you, but because I believe in what you're doing. Because maybe, just maybe, helping others is the only way I can begin to forgive myself." His words catch Clara off guard, piercing through her anger and planting a seed of doubt. She studies him carefully, noting the sincerity in his eyes, the way his hands clench and unclench as if grappling with invisible demons. There's vulnerability in his posture, humility in his tone, qualities she never expected to find in someone like him. Slowly, hesitantly, she nods. "Okay," she says, her voice barely audible. "But if we're going to do this, you need to prove it. No more excuses. No more running away." Richard nods fervently, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. "Thank you," he whispers, his voice thick with gratitude. "You won't regret this." Over the following weeks, Richard throws himself into Clara's world with a determination that surprises even her. He begins attending volunteer meetings at the community center where she works, offering advice on fundraising strategies and networking opportunities. At first, the other volunteers are skeptical of him. His polished demeanor and lingering air of authority set him apart from the scrappy, grassroots group, but Clara vouches for him, insisting that he's sincere. Gradually, they warm up to him, especially when his ideas start yielding results. One particularly memorable scene takes place during a brainstorming session in the cramped basement office of the community center. Clara and Richard sit side by side at a cluttered table, surrounded by stacks of papers, half-empty coffee cups, and mismatched chairs. The room buzzes with energy as volunteers debate plans for an upcoming charity gala aimed at raising funds for homeless shelters. Richard listens intently, jotting notes in a leather-bound notebook that looks incongruously luxurious compared to the rest of the setting. When it's his turn to speak, Richard leans forward, his expression animated in a way Clara hasn't seen before. "What if we approached local businesses for sponsorships?" he suggests, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. Not just asking for donations, but proposing partnerships that benefit both parties. For example, we could offer advertising space at the event in exchange for financial support. The room falls silent as everyone processes his idea. One volunteer raises an eyebrow skeptically. "And how exactly do you propose we convince these businesses to say yes? Most of them don't even acknowledge our emails." Richard smiles faintly, a flicker of his old confidence returning. "Leave that part to me," he says. "Let's draft a proposal together, and I'll handle the outreach." Clara watches him closely, marveling at the transformation taking place before her eyes. Gone is the defeated man who begged for bus fare in the park. In his place stands someone driven by purpose, channeling his talents toward something greater than himself. It's a side of Richard she never imagined existed, and it fills her with a cautious hope. As Richard becomes more involved in Clara's projects, however, tensions begin to surface. Some volunteers remain wary of him, whispering behind his back about his past and questioning his motives. Others admire his contributions, but worry that his presence might overshadow Clara's leadership. Even Clara herself feels conflicted at times, torn between gratitude for his help and lingering resentment over the pain he caused her family. These tensions come to a head during a heated argument at the community center. The scene unfolds late, one evening, after most of the volunteers have gone home. Clara and Richard are alone in the office, reviewing budgets for the upcoming gala. Clara flips through a spreadsheet, her brow furrowed in concentration, when Richard interrupts her train of thought. "Have you considered reaching out to some of your old contacts?" he asks casually, referring to the list of potential sponsors he's compiled. "People who might still remember your name?" Clara freezes, her pen hovering midair. "My old contacts?" she repeats, her tone icy. "You mean the ones who stopped calling after my dad's company went under? The ones who acted like we didn't exist anymore?" Richard winces, realizing too late how insensitive his suggestion sounds. "That's not what I meant," he stammers. "I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Clara snaps, slamming the spreadsheet onto the table. "This isn't about me, Richard. It's about the people we're trying to help. If you're here to relive your glory days or clear your conscience, then maybe you should leave." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily speechless. When he finally finds his voice, it's tinged with desperation. "That's not why I'm here, Clara," he insists. "I'm here because I believe in what you're doing. Because I want to make things right, not just for your family, but for everyone I've wronged." Clara crosses her arms, her expression unreadable. "Then prove it," she says firmly. "Prove that you're not just using this as a way to feel better about yourself. Show me that you're willing to put in the work, no matter how hard it gets." Richard nods solemnly, understanding the challenge she's issuing. "I will," he promises, "whatever it takes." Just as Richard and Clara begin to find a rhythm in their partnership, another twist threatens to unravel everything. One afternoon, while sorting through old files at the community center, Clara stumbles upon a document that sends chills down her spine. It's a legal agreement dated several years ago, detailing a loan her father took out to finance one of his failing ventures. The lender's signature at the bottom belongs to none other than Richard Alden. Her hands tremble as she reads the fine print, piecing together the implications. The loan came with exorbitant interest rates and strict repayment terms that ensured Thomas Bennett would default if anything went wrong. Which, of course, it did. Clara feels sick to her stomach as realization dawns. Richard hadn't just betrayed her father's trust, he'd actively set him up for failure. She confronts him later that evening, her voice shaking with rage. "Did you know this would happen?" she demands, shoving the document into his hands. "Did you know my dad wouldn't be able to pay you back?" Richard scans the page, his face pale with shock. "No," he says hoarsely. "I swear, Clara, I didn't know. This wasn't supposed to happen." But Clara doesn't believe him. "How could you not know?" she shouts, tears streaming down her face. "You're a businessman, Richard. You knew exactly what you were doing." The argument escalates, culminating in Clara storming out of the community center and leaving Richard standing alone in the dimly lit room. For the first time since their partnership began, he wonders if redemption is truly possible, or if some mistakes are simply too great to overcome. Before we move on, let's pause to reflect on this pivotal chapter. The climax of Richard and Clara's story is filled with tension, betrayal, and the fragile hope of reconciliation. Their journey is far from over, but the choices they make next will determine whether they can move forward together, or if the wounds of their past are too deep to heal. If you're interested in their story and eager to see how it unfolds, subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring complex narratives like this to life. The fallout from Clara's discovery of the loan agreement leaves an unbridgeable chasm between her and Richard, at least for now. For days she avoids him entirely, refusing to answer his calls or respond to his messages. Each attempt he makes to reach out is met with silence, a cold wall of rejection that cuts deeper than any accusation ever could. Meanwhile, Richard retreats into himself, consumed by guilt and self-loathing. He spends hours pacing the tiny room he rents above a diner, replaying their argument in his mind and wondering if he'll ever be able to repair the damage he's caused. But just as it seems, their fragile connection might shatter completely. Fate intervenes in ways neither of them could have anticipated. One evening, as Clara sits at her cluttered desk in her cramped apartment, she receives a letter that sends her world spinning. It's from a collection agency demanding immediate payment on debts left behind by her father's failed business ventures. The amount is staggering, far beyond anything she can possibly afford. Her hands tremble as she reads through the fine print, realizing that these debts have been accruing interest for years, quietly lurking in the shadows until now. Panic sets in as she calculates her options. Between tuition fees, rent, and living expenses, she barely scrapes by as it is. There's no way she can cover this debt without sacrificing everything she's worked so hard to build. For the first time in years, she feels the crushing weight of helplessness pressing down on her chest. Desperate for advice, she reaches out to Linda, her colleague from the cafe. Over coffee the next morning, Clara explains the situation, her voice trembling with frustration and fear. "I don't know what to do," she admits, tears welling up in her eyes. "If I don't pay, they'll come after me. But if I try, I'll lose everything." Linda listens sympathetically, offering words of encouragement but little practical guidance. "Maybe you should talk to someone who knows about this stuff," she suggests gently. "Someone with experience dealing with creditors." The comment lingers in Clara's mind long after their conversation ends. She knows exactly who Linda is referring to, even though the thought of asking Richard for help fills her with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she resents him for the role he played in her family's downfall. On the other, she recognizes his expertise in navigating financial crises. Could she really swallow her pride and turn to him for assistance? After days of internal debate, Clara finally decides to take the risk. She texts him late one night, keeping her message brief and to the point. "We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow." Richard responds almost instantly, his reply tinged with cautious hope. "Of course, whatever you need." When they meet the following afternoon, the tension between them is palpable. Clara arrives first, sitting stiffly on the same bench where they first encountered each other. When Richard approaches, she doesn't greet him warmly. Instead, she thrusts the letter into his hands without explanation. "Read this," she says curtly, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. Richard scans the document, his expression darkening as he processes its contents. When he looks up, his face is etched with concern. "Clara, I had no idea," he begins, but she cuts him off, sharply. "Save it," she snaps. "This isn't about you. Not directly, anyway. What I need right now is your help, not because I trust you, but because you're the only person who might actually know how to fix this." Her words sting, but Richard understands where they're coming from. He nods, slowly, setting the letter aside. "Tell me everything," he says simply. "I'll do whatever I can." Over the next hour, Clara lays out the full extent of her predicament, the mounting debts, the looming deadlines, the relentless pressure from creditors. Richard listens intently, his analytical mind already working through potential solutions. By the time she finishes speaking, he has a rough plan in place. "We'll start by negotiating with the collection agency," he explains, his tone calm and reassuring. "I'll draft a proposal outlining manageable repayment terms based on your current income. In the meantime, we can explore legal avenues to dispute some of these charges. They may not all be valid." Clara stares at him, torn between skepticism and gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" she asks bluntly. "After everything that's happened, why would you bother helping me?" Richard hesitates, choosing his words carefully. "Because I owe you," he says finally. "Not just for your father, but for giving me a chance when no one else would. And because," he trails off, his voice softening, "because I believe in you, Clara. You've got a fire inside you that reminds me of who I used to be before I lost my way. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's you." His sincerity disarms her, melting away some of the anger she's been carrying. Though she doesn't fully forgive him, not yet, she allows herself to accept his help, recognizing that she has no other choice. Just as Richard begins assisting Clara with her debt crisis, an unexpected opportunity arises that threatens to derail their progress. One morning, as he checks his email at the library, he finds a message from an old business associate named Victor Langston. Victor was once Richard's closest confidant, a ruthless deal-maker who thrived on high stakes, gambles, and cutthroat negotiations. They parted ways during Richard's downfall, but Victor never forgot the brilliance of Richard's strategies or the profits they generated. The email is concise but enticing. "Richard, I hear whispers of your return to the scene. Let's catch up over lunch. There's a project I think you'd be perfect for." At first, Richard deletes the message without a second thought. He's committed to helping Clara and rebuilding his life in a meaningful way. Returning to the corporate world feels like a betrayal of that promise. But as the days pass, the offer gnaws at the edges of his resolve. Memories of his former life creep back into his dreams. Luxurious offices, endless possibilities, the intoxicating rush of power. He tells himself it's just nostalgia, nothing more. Yet deep down, he wonders if he's truly capable of walking away from the allure of wealth and influence forever. Victor persists, sending follow-up emails and leaving voicemails until Richard reluctantly agrees to meet him for lunch. The restaurant is upscale, the kind of place Richard used to frequent during his glory days. As he walks in, heads turn to watch him, whispers spreading like wildfire. For a moment, he feels like the man he used to be, the man everyone admired and feared. Victor greets him with a hearty handshake and a knowing smile. "Richard Alden," he says, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's been too long." They sit down, and Victor wastes no time getting to the point. "Listen, I've got a proposition for you," he says, leaning forward conspiratorially. "A tech startup looking for a turnaround specialist. They're drowning in debt, but with your touch, we could triple their valuation within a year. Name your price." Richard listens silently, his mind racing. The numbers Victor throws out are staggering, enough to wipe away every mistake, every regret, every sleepless night, enough to give him back everything he's lost. But as tempting as the offer is, something holds him back. He thinks of Clara, of the community center, of the people counting on him to make a difference. Could he really abandon them for the sake of personal gain? "I'll think about it," he says evasively, rising from the table. "Thanks for reaching out," Victor smirks, clearly unconvinced. "Take your time," he says smoothly. "But remember, opportunities like this don't come around often." Third twist, Clara discovers the offer unbeknownst to Richard. Victor isn't the only one watching him closely. One of the volunteers at the community center, a young intern named Marcus, happens to overhear part of Richard's phone call with Victor while passing by the office. Intrigued, Marcus does some digging online and uncovers details about the lucrative offer. Believing he's doing Clara a favor, he shares the information with her later that week. Clara listens in stunned silence as Marcus recounts what he's learned. "Are you sure about this?" she asks, her voice trembling with disbelief. "He's really considering going back to that life?" Marcus shrugs apologetically. "That's what it looks like." "I'm sorry, Clara. I thought you deserved to know." When Clara confronts Richard later that evening, her anger is palpable. "So it's true," she says bitterly. "You're thinking about leaving us for money." Richard flinches, caught off guard by her knowledge of the offer. "Clara, it's not like that," he protests. "I haven't decided anything yet. I'm still here, aren't I?" "But for how long?" she demands, her voice rising. "How long until you decide that helping people isn't worth it anymore? Until you realize you can't live without the luxuries you're used to?" Her accusations cut deep, forcing Richard to confront the truth about his own motivations. Is he truly committed to this new path, or is he clinging to it out of desperation? Can he resist the pull of his old life, even when it promises redemption in the form of wealth and status? "I don't know," he admits finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I do know one thing. I won't make the same mistakes. Again, not with you, not with anyone." Clara studies him carefully, searching for signs of deception. For now she chooses to believe him, but the seed of doubt remains, threatening to grow if he falters even once. Before moving forward, let's pause to reflect on these twists. Each revelation adds layers of complexity to Richard and Clara's relationship, testing their trust and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. Their journey is far from over, but the choices they make in response to these challenges will define the trajectory of their lives. If you're captivated by their story and eager to see how it concludes, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to create content that explores the depths of human emotion and resilience. The tension between Richard and Clara reaches its zenith in the days following her discovery of Victor Langston's offer. Both are grappling with conflicting emotions, Clara torn between anger and hope, Richard wrestling with temptation and guilt. Their partnership, once a beacon of possibility, now teeters on the edge of collapse. Yet, amidst the chaos, there remains a flicker of something deeper, an unspoken understanding that their connection transcends mere circumstance. Whether it survives depends entirely on the choices they make next. For Richard, the decision is agonizing. On one hand, Victor's offer represents everything he thought he wanted, a chance to reclaim his former glory, to silence the voices whispering about his failures, to prove to himself and the world that he's still capable of greatness. The allure of wealth and power is intoxicating, a siren song pulling him back toward the life he left behind. But on the other hand, there's Clara, the embodiment of resilience, compassion, and purpose. She reminds him of who he used to be before greed consumed him, before ambition blinded him to the humanity of those around him. One evening, as he sits alone in his rented room, Richard pulls out the photograph of himself and Thomas Bennett, the same photo Clara had shown him weeks earlier. He stares at it for a long time, tracing the edges with trembling fingers. Memories flood back. Late-night strategy sessions fueled by coffee and camaraderie, shared laughter over victories, big and small, the unwavering trust Thomas placed in him as a friend and partner. And then the betrayal, the moment Richard allowed his own selfishness to destroy everything they'd built together. "I owe you this," Richard whispers to the image, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just to you, but to everyone I've hurt." With newfound clarity, Richard drafts a response to Victor's email. It's brief, but firm. "Victor, thank you for the opportunity, but I'm afraid I must decline. My priorities have shifted, and I've found purpose in a different kind of work. Best of luck with the project." As he hits send, a wave of relief washes over him, not because the decision was easy, but because it was right. For the first time in years, Richard feels aligned with his values, no longer chasing validation from a world that thrives on exploitation and excess. He knows the road ahead won't be easy. Rebuilding trust takes time, and Clara may never fully forgive him. But he's willing to try, not for redemption, but because he genuinely believes in the work they're doing together. Meanwhile, Clara, watched, struggles with her own internal conflict. Part of her wants to push Richard away completely, to sever ties and protect herself from further heartache. After all, she spent years building walls to shield herself from the pain of betrayal, and letting Richard in feels dangerously vulnerable. Yet, another part of her recognizes the sincerity in his actions, the genuine effort he's made to help her navigate her family's debts and support the community center. Despite her lingering resentment, she can't deny the positive impact he's had on their projects or the way he's inspired others to believe in themselves. Her breakthrough comes during a quiet moment at the community center. She's organizing supplies for an upcoming event when Marcus approaches her, holding a stack of flyers. "You know," he says hesitantly, "I might have overstepped when I told you about Richard's offer. I didn't want you to get hurt again." Clara sighs, setting down the box she's carrying. "It's okay, Marcus. You were looking out for me. But maybe—" She pauses, considering her words carefully. "Maybe I need to stop running from people who've made mistakes. Isn't that what we're trying to teach here? That everyone deserves a second chance?" Marcus nods slowly, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Later that night, Clara visits Richard at his apartment. He answers the door cautiously, clearly expecting another confrontation. Instead, she steps inside without a word, closing the distance between them until they're standing face to face. "I read your email to Victor," she says softly, her gaze steady. "Why did you turn it down?" Richard exhales sharply, caught off guard by her question. "Because I realized I don't want to go back to that life," he admits. "Not if it means losing sight of what really matters. what you've shown me matters. Clara studies him closely, searching for any hint of deception. When she finds none, she nods slowly. Okay, she says simply. But if we're going to keep working together, you need to promise me something. Anything, Richard replies earnestly. That you'll never stop fighting for yourself, for others, for the things we believe in. Because if you do, then none of this will mean anything. Richard meets her gaze, his expression resolute. I promise. In the months that follow, Richard and Clara pour their energy into transforming the community center into a thriving hub of support and empowerment. With Richard's business acumen and Clara's passion for social justice, they secure funding from local sponsors, expand their outreach programs, and create partnerships with organizations dedicated to helping marginalized communities. The charity gala they planned becomes a resounding success, raising enough money to fund several new initiatives aimed at combating homelessness and poverty. One particularly poignant scene unfolds during the gala itself. As Richard stands at the podium addressing the crowd, his voice trembles with emotion. When I lost everything, he begins, I thought my life was over, but meeting Clara and seeing the incredible work being done here taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents. It's measured in the connections we forge, the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind. The audience erupts in applause, many moved to tears by his words. Clara watches from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. Though their relationship remains complicated, built on a foundation of forgiveness rather than forgetfulness, she knows they've created something extraordinary together. The story concludes 1 year later, on the day the community center officially opens its doors as a permanent facility. A large crowd gathers outside, cheering as Richard and Clara cut the ribbon together. Behind them, a plaque bears the inscription, dedicated to second chances. As the camera pans across the joyful faces of volunteers, beneficiaries, and supporters, Richard and Clara exchange a glance filled with mutual respect and gratitude. They may never fully heal the wounds of the past, but they've forged a bond stronger than either could have imagined, a testament to the power of redemption, empathy, and human connection. Before the screen fades to black, a final voiceover delivers the story's central message. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the belief that they deserve a second chance. This marks the end of our story. Through Richard and Clara's journey, we've explored themes of loss, forgiveness, and the transformative power of kindness. If you've been moved by their story and would like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue crafting narratives that inspire, challenge, and resonate deeply. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey.